Good morning. Today I'll be speaking on philosophical methodologies in higher education. This will comprise of three lectures. The first one is questioning as a method in the Upanishads and in Greek philosophy. So questioning as an inquiring act. So this is the issue which I'll be taking up. As a matter of fact, whether a philosopher has stated or has not stated, he has intended or he has not intended, he is doing it knowingly or unknowingly, but it happens that every philosopher is obsessed to have thought in a certain way and has followed a doctrine, a definite method to vindicate his position. There has been also an attempt in the history of philosophy where philosophers have tried to go beyond method also. But for that, again, they needed some kind of a method or the other. A method or a perspective or an approach uh, is something which helps the philosopher to vindicate, articulate, and present forth his vision of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethical doctrines. Methodology can be said as a study of methods, and a method is a procedure, a way of doing certain things, acting on things or relations, arguing on viewpoints, thinking on ideas, concepts, elaborating issues, etc. So we can see that a method is at the at the very heart of a particular thinking. One of our philosophers, Professor Dayakrishna, had said in his book, The Nature of Philosophy, he has said that philosophers not only think in certain ways, but also think that they think in certain ways. It is the strangest thing in the world. We breathe, but we do not think about breathing. We are alive, but we do not think about living. We think, but do not think about thinking. It is when we try to think about thinking that method and perspective or approach becomes something very, very important. Now, the question is that uh, how do we say that what a philosophy is? Or what are the questions which make uh, the question philosophical, not the questions of economics, political science, anthropology, or sociology, for that matter. Yeah, but only that it is a philosophy kind of a thing. So my understanding is that everything is not philosophy, but everything can be philosophized. So that means if we find certain discrepancies, contestations, and some kind of contending claims, then philosophy begins. So long back in 1998, so W.B. Galilei, he had written one book, one article, where he had introduced the concept, essentially contested concepts. It was published in the Aristotelian Society, uh, Contested and Contestable, Aristotelian Society, on March 12th, 1956. He had published this book, this article, and then it became a kind of, and a kind of, fundamental thing to think about philosophy. Now, uh, I will begin with some issues where philosophy has taken certain turns in the course of its development. Particularly, if we look at the Greek philosophy, it was the time of Heraclitus, that is around 6th century BC, that philosophical issues started getting changed, molded into something, a kind of transition from mythos to logos. Mythos is a very important term in the course of development, and you know, a myth, one of the most profound myths which people have is that man is in the image of God. Creation could be regarded as a myth. Joshua commanding the earth to stand still and everything else should revolve around it. Adam, Eve, and Abel episode, and fall, loss of the paradise, and sin, curse, redemption, the day of the judgment. So, in a way, this all becomes a myth in the sense that the date is not available to us. That's why it cannot be classified, it cannot be identified as a history kind of a thing. So, during 6th century BC, with Heraclitus, he shifted philosophical questions from mythos to logos. So, logocentric approach started coming up. And his contention was that if we speak with intelligence, we must base our strength on that which is common to all. That means logos. Logos basically looks for the something which is common to all. That means some kind of a generalizations should be there. Universality should be there. And if it regards to the city, then in the city as certain laws which are operating in the city, that is called the nomos. And together, when people start living on the basis of those laws, then it makes ethos. So three new terms came up with Heraclitus: logos, nomos, and ethos. And these three terms started identifying the course of philosophical development. There is a shift from the kind of method which has been used in the vindication of a myth to a method which has been used to advocate logos, nomos, and the ethos. Gradually, when we come to the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the Greek trio, there we find that logos has further developed. It has developed to the extent of becoming dialogos. And it is the dialogos or the dialogue that that was the beginning of the philosophical method here, very substantially. And in the dialogue, we find there are certain questions which has been posed, and in an attempt to find the answer of those questions, you know, uh, there is an inquiry, which begins with that. Socrates used to call himself as a seeker. A philosopher is a seeker of knowledge. And seeking knowledge means raising questions and trying to find out the uh, answer to it. One of the fundamental questions which Socrates had raised was that we come across one entity and we also come across many entities. But what could be the relationship between the two, between one and many? This was a very big problem, intellectual problem, academic problem, and also the epistological and metaphysical problem during the time of Socrates. And the answer which he tried to advocate to solve this problem was that if we can find the universal features, that means if we are in a position to define it, then it becomes philosophical. Same way in Indian philosophy also, particularly in the Upanishads, we come across several dialogues. And in order to answer those, it begins with a question. And the question is meant to inquire about the meaning aspect of it. For instance, Uddalak, and he had his son Swetaketu, who had gone to this. This can be found in the Chandogya Upanishad, and also Gita has several such illustrations, which can be taken the help. And Uddalak, he comes back from his Gurukul, and then his father asks him, sorry, Shwetaketu comes back, and his father Uddalak asks him that, have you known that after knowing which, everything else is known? Ek Vijnana tu Sarv Vijnana. Then Shwetaketu says that I do not know. Perhaps my teacher also did not know, because if he had known, he would have taught me. He would have definitely told me about it. And then the dialogue goes on. A very long debate dialogue is there. Several questions were raised, and all the questions were very substantive. And this shows that there is a constant inquiry, inclination to know about the thing. This is how the method started, in the early Greek philosophy, in the Upanishads. So if we look at the dialogue, then how does a dialogue work? And the method, in fact. So in a dialogue, it is known as dialogo. That means there are two persons, and both the speakers, they speak, they listen to each other. Both of them aim at truth. They understand each other's language, and they also understand each other's way of thinking, and they do not live in two worlds whose contents totally differ. So there are certain moments of agreement and disagreement. Agreements like, that both of them aim at truth. They understand each other's languages. They listen to each other. They speak to each other, but their views are completely different. Their way of arguing and substantiating the position is something which is very different. So there is a moment of agreement and disagreement in a dialogue. And as if we study the dialogues, then we find that master and the student, they exchange their places. The speaker becomes the listener, and the listener becomes the speaker. In Indian tradition, particularly in the Upanishads, we come across various questions. There is a prashna, there is pariprashna, there is also ati prashna, kind of a thing. So the questions in the Upanishads are not shallow curiosity type of questions, which is generally addressed in terms of who said so, what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, why did it happen, how did it happen, etc., etc. These are very shallow kind of curiosities. Rather, the questions in the Upanishads are some are, something which is far deeper, dealing with the purpose of life, ways to get everlasting joy, source of creation, concerning Brahman, Atman, and the Jagat, etc. That is churned out not only after some serious, churned out of, very serious reflection on these issues. Even there is one Upanishad entitled as Prashna Upanishad, which begins and continues till the end with questions. The Upanishads deal with questions which arise when men begin to reflect seriously and attempt to find the answers to them. They carry out of much reflection. Now, the tradition of questioning is something which is identified in India, in Indian philosophy, as a jnana marga. So the questions were permitted and presented logically in the knowledge tradition, universally termed as the path of knowledge, that is Jnana Marga. The path of inquiry, that means Vichar, gets tread mostly by those who have natural intellectual inclination to think and analyze their way in their seeking. There is no question of blind faith or dogma in this path, as The teacher of the Upanishad points out the way in the most logical manner that appeals to the rational questions asked by the seekers of truth to the enlightened teacher with exceptional ability and uh, earnestness, including an illuminating, educating, interrogating about the higher truths as experienced by the teacher. So the questions were raised, to the people who are uh, very knowledgeable people in that area. So the question is also termed as some kind of an inquiry. It also has certain queries into it, and it was basically the questioning as an act of inquiry that is regarded as a system of understanding and interpretation, an attempt to find the hidden meanings of a text or a subject of inquiry. So, with the questioning, we find out what is the hidden meaning of a particular text. It is in the method of dialogue which has been used in the Upanishads and the early Greek philosophy in the 4th century. So, dialogue is the way of doing it, raising the questions and trying to find out the answer. There are so many statements in the Upanishads uh, concerning knowledge and immortality of soul, questions concerning ko-aham, or in the Greek tradition, know thyself, etc., which are so metaphorical, aphoristic, symbolic, suggestive, quite often puzzling, and even paradoxical, that we cannot understand them without questioning, interrogating, or dialoguing with somebody or the other. Now, the kinds of questions are of many kinds, and the operative term of a dialogue is basically those things that is agreement and disagreement. The metaphors, symbols, paradoxes, aphorisms, etc., which have been used, on which the question keeps on, coming up again and again. It has evolved sometimes even to the extent of going to mysticism and becoming completely monologue. So there are various such occasions where the sage has become silent completely. Even Socrates also had faced this kind of a problem. So there are over dozens of such dialogues from which these features or the key terms can be extracted. We can just furnish some of these instances of dialogue, particularly with reference to the knowledge and consciousness kind of a thing. So some of the questions, very briefly, I will place before you. That is in Chandogya Upanishad, for instance. Uddalak asked his son Swetaketu, what is that by knowing which everything else is known? This is the kind of question which I had just placed before you. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Maitreyi asks her husband, sage Yagyavalk, tell me, venerable sir, of that alone which you know to be the only means of attaining immortality. Very serious question, and the dialogue goes on for a very long time. So this is another thing. In the Kena Upanishad, it starts with the question: what activates our mind? What is the mind of the mind? What is behind the mind? What is behind our senses activating them? And then there is a long debate on this issue. Nachiketa in the Katha Upanishad asks Yama what happens to the person after death. Some say that he exists, some say that a person does not exist. Then Yama Nachiketa debate also goes on, you know, to a great extent, very long thing, kind of thing. In the Prashnopanishad, there are 6 questions which are very pertinent, and there is ethics before education in ancient schools. So, like the first question, how did life begin? What is a living being? Second question. Third, what is the nature of man and how is it so? Third question. What establishes man? What is meditation and why to meditate? What is immortal man, etc., etc. The questions are there, then answers are there. uh, I may not be able to go into all the details of it, but I would like to place before you, uh, when the questions were raised, then to the first question, whence are living beings created? The verse 1.4 of Prashnopanishad, the sage Pipalada answered that Prajapati did tapas. Tapas means heat, meditative penance, austerity, and created two principles: Riya, matter, that is feminine, and Pran, spirit, masculine, thinking that, quote, these together will create, will couple to create, to produce for me creatures in many ways. Now, then there are counter questions. And then again, some query emerges, again, questions are raised, and the dialogue goes on like that only. And if we read Bhagavad Gita, particularly Mahabharata, there we find that Arjuna has asked almost 27 questions to Sri Krishna. And beginning with what is righteous karma, if karma is binding, how should you get free from the fruits of actions, the karma, what is jnana, what is better path between jnana and karma. This way the question goes on and on. Even after preaching the entire Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna did not insist upon Arjuna that that he should go and fight the war. He said that I have taught you everything. I have answered all your questions. Now I leave it on you, your wisdom, your decision, whether you want to go to fight for the war or not. He leaves it. But the question goes on like this only. Similarly, in the Greek philosophy also, the dialogue is something which is very fundamentally there, and at every issue, we find that Socrates, when it comes to the philosophical scene in the Greek philosophy, he shifted Greek philosophy from physics to ethics. Now, ethical questions concerning knowledge, virtues, and even the immortality of soul, etc., started coming up very substantially in the Greek philosophy. And there are, you know, several dialogues which are there and to substantiate the position. So the questions in the Greek philosophy, particularly in Plato's Theaetetus, we find that in discussing the question of the nature of knowledge, Theaetetus advances a very ostensive kind of a definition, that knowledge of, making shoes and etc., etc., knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and harmony, calculation. But then Socrates was interested in finding out the knowledge of knowledge in abstraction, and the dialogue goes on, for a long time. Yeah. So, definition of excellence. You know, they are in search for the excellence. So that excellence is to be, defined. Wisdom is to be defined. Courage is to be defined. Even the question of justice is to be defined, and tolerance is to be defined. Yeah, all the concepts which were there. In fact, the virtues, if we look at the Old Testament of the Bible, we find that they had furnished uh, acquired virtues and infused virtues. Now, in the infused virtues, we have love, hope, faith, and grace. So, these are the virtues maybe with which we are born. But the acquired virtues like toleration, like liberality and justice, etc., it can be acquired in the, with practice, with knowledge, and with dialogue and everything. But when we come to the Greek philosophy, the infused virtues have no role to play, and it's only the acquired virtues in terms of cardinal virtues and moral virtues, intellectual virtues, from Plato to Aristotle. This is how it started prevailing over. And in Greek philosophy, though there is a place of God, but the God is not, uh, theos did not mean God in Greek philosophy. It meant goodness. And goodness is also the demiurge, the creator for the Greek philosophers. So it's the idea of the good which prevails over everything. So in the process of defining, articulating, and presenting, so we find that this is how it goes about. So in the dialogue, we generally find that uh, uh, there is a moment of conversation. Two persons are talking to each other, and there is an effort involved through which you can bring all the ideas of a particular subject at one place. So various views come across, and on one subject, all the ideas which are otherwise scattered in the intellectual world are all brought together, so that now you can chronologically arrange it. So all the ideas are brought together. Then we can also make an arrangement that from a less adequate idea, we try to go to something which is more adequate. So this is something which is very wonderful. And this all requires a kind of methodological approach into it. Now, the further thing we find that, we go from particular examples to something which is universal, because it was basically search for the universality. The method was used so that universal features can be, uh, arranged and advocated. And the method which was particularly, or the procedure which they had adopted, was inductive. That means from particular we go to the universal. This is how it was done and developed in the Greek philosophy. Now, uh, when the questions are raised, then we find that the questioning is a process of conversation, argumentation, and mutual supplementation of ideas between two individuals. It's not that questioning means that you are repudiating everything. Rather, there is an attempt to mutually supplement. It is a kind of method known as a dialogue in which the encounters with other thinkers are essential. It is just opposed to a monologue, which can formulate nothing but a dogma. The ideas I formulate to defend my standpoint must confront with other approaches, must give expression to other thinkers as others, and not as possible uh, elements of a system in which I can recognize my own thought. Other thinkers must be permitted to speak as others on the same subject. I am and remain only a participant. So it is a method of participation in which two persons with opposed viewpoints, they argue with each other, and there is a constant participation in search for something which is universal, and which can be recorded and given it to the posterity. So with this, I would like to stop about the method aspect of it, and then I will proceed to the other things gradually.